And just thank you to all of our speakers for being here. Really, really appreciate it. It's so nice to see all of your faces.
Okay, so I think we're going to get going. I believe one of our speakers had a commitment that ran just a few minutes past the hour, and they'll be joining us soon, but we'll get going now. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for being here. This is the Core on Strike, Labor, Contingency, and Curriculum, which is a teach-in that's a part of the GWC UAW's digital Picket. And we're so excited to have a fantastic set of panelists today who are going to be talking about a number of topics, including the history and the future of the core curriculum here at Columbia, the origins of Western civilization courses, in quotes, and their entwinement with white supremacy, student activism to change the core curriculum here at Columbia, and finally, Columbia administration's deep reliance on underpaid graduate labor to teach the core. And that's sort of been a constant since its inception in 1919 and 1937 for Lit Hum, but has been, as we'll be talking about, is a sort of increasing part of the way these courses are taught here at Columbia. So our goal today will be to ask how these questions about labor exploitation, canon formation, and general education courses are interconnected. We'll also be learning about the past and future of educational resistance to the core in the form of student activism. So this event was principally organized by Catherine Bergevin, Erica Drennan, me, I'm Luke Levinsky, and Elizabeth Heinges. We are all current Lit Hum, that's Literature Humanities graduate instructors on strike. Lit Hum, as it's known, is a nearly all white, nearly all male authored syllabus. It runs from, in its current form, Homer to Toni Morrison. It added its first female author, Jane Austen, to the syllabus in 1985, 2 years after women were first matriculated in Columbia College, and its first Black author, Toni Morrison, in 2015, so 6 years ago. Many of us, instructors, students, and colleagues, believe this course needs to change far more radically and far more quickly. And we're here today to think about how. Before we introduce our speakers, which we'll do one-on-one, our format today will be short talks, and they'll be followed by a Q&A. And we'll be introducing our speakers before each one speaks. But before we get to that, we'd just like to give kind of a quick round of numbers about grad labor in several core classes, which I'll hand it off to Elizabeth for.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom. I am, as my students know well, hopeless at figuring out share screens. So just bear with me for 1 second. And while I get this slideshow up. Okay. All right. So I hope this is visible. Okay, so Will had added this slide to this PowerPoint just to give you guys all a sense of what the syllabus looked like for fall or winter semester 1956, 1957. And for those of you who have taken Lit Hum or in the past or are currently taking it now, many of these texts may look very familiar. This is a syllabus, at least in part, that has stayed very much the same. And we can talk a lot about why that is, I hope, later over the course of this conversation today. So I had a sense of how many graduate students were teaching literature humanities on the basis of seeing emails, seeing my colleagues in Zoom meetings. But when we had decided to plan this event today, I was really curious to do some number crunching about how these numbers panned out across the entirety of the core. And I found some surprising results. So as you see here, Lit Hum by the numbers. In fall 2020, so these are all figures for this year, almost 1,300 Columbia College students were enrolled in 62 sections of Lit Hum. Of these, 21 are taught by graduate instructors. Preceptors were called. 21 are taught by contingent faculty. These are faculty members who are not tenure track or tenured. Most often they are lecturers, as in the case of Lit Hum. We have 11 Lit Hum lecturers teaching 19 sections. And sometimes in other cases, adjuncts, faculty or instructors who are hired on a course-by-course basis and paid on a course-by-course basis without benefits. So 6 sections were taught by assistant faculty, 5 by associates, 7 by full professors, and 2 by university administrators and staff. So this is a total of 42 sections. Over 2/3, 67.7%, are taught by contingent labor, that is by graduate instructors and contingent faculty. For those more visually inclined, I made a little pie chart. This is numbers of instructors rather than numbers of sections. But as you can see here, the kind of ratios pan out the same. We have 2/3 of Lit Hum instructors are graduate preceptors or contingent faculty members. For CC, as also expected, similar percentages. So 1,200 Columbia College students in 60 sections of CC this last fall, 65% of which, or 39 sections, taught by grad instructors, contingent faculty, or a non-core office postdoc. For Music Hum, Art Hum, and UW, I got some surprising figures. And maybe someone can jump in why this might be, who has more knowledge of these particular courses. But I was really surprised to see that of the 682 students enrolled in 32 sections, 84.38% of those sections are taught by grad instructors, contingent faculty, or postdocs. Only 5 are taught by tenure track or tenured faculty. For Art Hum, the numbers become even worse. 94% of Art Hum sections are taught by grad instructors, contingent faculty, or non-core office postdocs. Only 2 taught by tenure track or tenured faculty. And last, university writing. Almost unilaterally taught by contingent labor, especially graduate instructors in both the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and the School of the Arts. No university writing sections in the fall were taught by tenure track or tenured faculty. Why is this? So reliance on graduate student labor and contingent labor is part of a longer term trend. This beautiful chart, courtesy of a Spectator article from 2016. About 30 years ago, 47% of Lit Hum and CC sections were taught by tenure track and tenured faculty members, whereas 5 years ago, only 28% of those sections were taught by faculty. And these numbers have held pretty much the same. This fall, I think the number is 29% of Lit Hum sections, at least, were taught by tenure track and tenured faculty. Again, we can, I think the reasoning behind this, I hope maybe Jason will talk a little bit about, or we can discuss in further, but I think clearly indicates that the core curriculum, the courses that Columbia and Columbia's administration and the admissions program celebrate as the foundations of its curriculum are not being properly invested into. Arts and sciences on an administrative level, not on a faculty level. I know our faculty are all supportive and do not like this either, but are not putting the money into the core to provide their instructors with fair working conditions and compensation that also provide the best learning conditions for their students. And just to kind of transition slowly on the subject of curricular form, since it's perhaps, as Catherine, I think, noted, the last 2 days I can use this meme, right? Oftentimes I feel like our efforts to rethink the syllabus, the syllabi of these courses feels like this tiny digger, right, in the Suez Canal. But just as this giant container ship was finally moved, so too, I think, can we find there are possibilities, real ones, for these curricula to change. All right, and I'm going to stop sharing screen if I can figure this out again. And thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Elizabeth. So we're going to just now go to our first speaker on the panel. Dostal Padilla is an associate professor in the Department of Classics at Princeton, where he is also affiliated with the programs in Latino Studies and Latin American Studies, as well as the University Center for Human Values. A scholar of Roman history and classical reception in contemporary American and Latin American cultures, Dostal is the author of Divine Institutions, Religion and Community in the Middle Roman Republic from Princeton in 2020, and Undocumented, a Dominican boy's odyssey from a homeless shelter to the Ivy League from Penguin in 2015, and the co-editor of Rome, Empire of Plunder, The Dynamics of Cultural Appropriation. He has a brilliant open access 2020 article on Roman epistemicide, and it is this epistemicide that will be reckoned with in his current book project, A People's History of Ancient Rome, a recalibration of Roman history told from the ground up. He's a former fellow also of Columbia's Society of Fellows in the Humanities and has taught with the Justice in Education initiative, and also recently at Princeton, a co-taught course on rupturing tradition, ancient past, contemporary praxis with the activist graduate school. So thank you so much for being with us today, Dostal.
Thank you so much, Will, for the introduction. It's an honor to be here in support of the GWC UAW Digital Picket. And I want to begin by thanking Elizabeth for extending the invitation on behalf of the LitHum preceptors. And I want to not just commend and extol, but express solidarity for all of the work that each of you on this Zoom has been doing and continues to do to call for humane and fair working conditions, and to make that the cornerstone of the relationship between contingent and precarious labor and the university. I want to spend the next few minutes attempting in conversation, as a prequel to conversation with you all, to set out something that at first occurred to me when I was teaching in the core while at the Society of Fellows, something that I couldn't properly articulate to myself at the time, but that nonetheless became more and more conspicuous in my own reflection on the demands of that pedagogy as the demands of that pedagogy intersected with the organizational structure and labor imperatives and capitalist formations of Columbia more broadly, and as they continue to define my evolving responsibilities in the academy and in sectors of work life adjacent to the academy. The question distilled to its essence is whether the teaching I was doing, and specifically the text in CC and LitHum that I was teaching, provided intellectual resources for thinking through and undoing the structures of labor exploitation that characterize the 21st century university. If they did provide these resources, then where exactly were they in the syllabus? How could I sort of mobilize those resources? And if they didn't, what could I do in my own pedagogy and in my engagements with these texts in classroom and outside of classroom spaces to teach against these texts, to counter teach as and when necessary? Let me share some slides now in order to zero in on particular aspects of the entanglement of my teaching with this question and as a prequel to laying out what I think are viable answers, although I should stress that I do not have finalized answers by any stretch. Voila. So I thought it would be appropriate to begin with two chunks of text. The selections are taken respectively from this incredible essay by my colleague at Brown, Sasha May Eccleston, entitled "The Fall After the Summer of Solidarity," and from Brett Nielsen and Sandro Mesadra's "Order as Method or the Multiplication of Labor." I'll begin with the quotation from Eccleston's essay, and I want to concentrate my attention in the next few minutes on one of its more important takeaways that will become clear as I wind down the reading from the piece. This is in the course of a reflection on the writings of Frantz Fanon and an initiative organized by EOS Africana to organize, to promote reading groups centered on Fanon for classicists last fall. This is, for my money, one of the most remarkable statements to have been put on the digital screen by a classicist in the past 2 years. And so I thought it was important to share it with you all. If the model of intellectual one holds on to entails a stable mastery, Eccleston writes, the confrontation Fanon imagines in the section of Wretched of the Earth that discusses the colonized intellectual crosses over from humbling to humiliation. But there are models other than mastery available. And in light of those models, there is no shame in admitting that the way that we've been trained, the skills we have learned to complete projects recognizable within our disciplines, may not empower us to do the work that emancipatory projects demand. We may very well have to unlearn those skills and instead learn from those excluded by the framing of our disciplines and the gates of our institutions, end quote. I want to accentuate Eccleston's emphasis. There is no shame, because often what I have found to inflect conversations with putatively well-meaning colleagues at my current institution, at my previous institution, and in other academic contexts, is the waves of shame that come over whenever we come to the moment of crisis and it is recognized or acknowledged that some of the intellectual faculties that have been sharpened and honed in the course of our training, some of the circumstances of our professionalization to which we have been subject, are inadequate to the task of preparing us to engage in the kinds of emancipatory work that would meaningfully transform our communities, that would meaningfully transform our universities. And it's that I want to reckon with you all today. The second passage comes in the course of a discussion of the emergence of area studies in border as method, or the multiplication of labor. And I wanted to center it because as part of my own formation at the Society of Fellows at Columbia, I had become increasingly interested in the history of area studies and its collisions, fractious and otherwise, with the institutionalization and redefinition of the core at Columbia, and with the shifting institutional statuses of disciplines like classics in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. I had originally gravitated to the idea that the area studies moment was in many respects a profoundly liberatory moment, and I still hold fast to this idea. But one of the issues raised in Nielsen and Ms. Adra's book is that there are ways of understanding the emergence of area studies, even as it emerges in critique to and in counterpoint to the existing institutional imperatives associated with the Western civilizational constructs of things like the core, that make plain area studies entanglement with forms of institutional exploitation that seek to defang labor-centered critiques of the academy by siloing them into area studies. So let me read this passage and then revisit one of its core arguments in another few minutes. It becomes possible to discern how the new knowledge geography of area studies was linked institutionally and methodologically to attempts to deactivate and depoliticize labor movements around the world. The supposed emergence of industrial society cannot be extricated from the management of labor conflicts in the frame of a neutralized and technocratic view of development. Many authors have noted how area studies are implicated in the rise of post-World War II discourses and practices of development, replete with built-in temporal and spatial assumptions about progress and difference. The very form of the state, its legitimacy in the wake of decolonization, as well as its attempts to accomplish a full national citizenship through the generalization of wage labor and what Gramsci called industrialism, were shaped outside of the West by these discourses and practices. It was the age of the developmental state. This passage has resonated with me, especially in the course of reflections about my time at Columbia, when I was busy having conversations with folks who identified themselves as practitioners of developmental developmental studies and of development as an intellectual practice more generally. But it also bears on my own shifting identifications as a student of the ancient world. What had become clearer and clearer to me in the course of my time as an educator at Columbia, and has become even more trenchantly clear in my past few years at Princeton, is that the study of those contemporary political, labor, national, and international dispensations that are understood to subtend the workings of capital, both in the United States and around the world, is somehow held up to be in a different temporality than the temporality of classics, which is understood to be somehow very distant and therefore removed from the demands and imperatives of the present moment. I can't really accept this proposition anymore because it seems to me to be engaged in a work of mystification that assumes that disciplines such as classics are not answerable to the ethical and political demands of the contemporary moment. But there's another dimension to this too, which is that in order to think through to an emancipatory praxis within the academy, we would have to take seriously into consideration the possibility that even those area studies that emerge from the 60s and 70s conjuncture of interest to Nielsen and Misadra are implicated in another form of deactivating and depoliticizing labor, and that therefore the call is to reimagine the academy comprehensively as an academy that can entertain in the present forms of knowledge production that are vibrantly and resonantly attentive to the workings of capitalism without attempting to temporalize them or distance them in space and time such that they're seen to be illegible or somehow shrouded in some kind of glorious civilizational backdrop. I'll explain more what I mean by this when I turn to the next passage, which is a passage that will be familiar to many of you who teach in CC. One of my concerns during my time as a CC instructor was to clarify for folks in my classroom how best to take passages in authors who trailed very toxic legacies in their wake as invitations to engage in critique of the labor as racial imperatives that configured our 21st century environment. And I see this passage as doing some of this work, but in order to make clear how this passage can be flexed meaningfully to that work, I want to work through it in some detail. This passage is taken from Aristotle's Politics, from Book 8, from a discussion of education and of the forms that Aristotle believes are most appropriate for the education of the free male citizen. Already, the paradigm of education articulated by Aristotle in the opening sections of Book 8 of the Politics participates in various projects of exclusion that have been slowly and steadily legitimated by the argumentation in preceding books of the Politics. But this passage has been upheld in some circles as embodying an ideal of the liberal arts that moves beyond any sort of ostensible prioritization of the wage and of education for the sake of making money to something more elevated, something more noble. So I'll read the passage out loud and then conclude my remarks with some thoughts on what the passage invites us to do. Leisure activity is itself held to involve pleasure, happiness, and living blessedly. This is not available to those who are working, however, but only to those who are engaged in leisure activity. For one who is working is doing so for the sake of some end he does not possess, whereas happiness is an end that everyone thinks is accompanied not by pain, but by pleasure. This pleasure is not the same for everyone, however, but each takes it to be what suits himself in his condition, and the best person takes it to be the best pleasure, the one that comes from the noblest things. It is evident then that we should learn and be taught certain things that promote leisure activity, and these subjects and studies are undertaken for their own sake, whereas those relating to work are necessary and for the sake of things other than themselves. It is for this reason that our predecessors assigned music a place in education. Now we will get to why music is so important to Aristotle. They did not do so because they suppose that it is necessary for life, or it is nothing of the sort, or that like reading and writing, it is useful for making money, managing a household, acquiring further learning, or for a large number of political activities, or that like gymnastics, it promotes health and vigor, for we see that neither of these results from music. What remains then is that music is for pursuit and leisure, which is evidently the very reason our predecessors included it in education. But they give it a place among the leisured pursuits they consider appropriate for free people. Hence Homer's instruction to call the bard alone to the rich banquet. And he goes on to mention certain others who call the bard that he may bring delight to all. Elsewhere, Odysseus says that the best best leisured pursuit is when men are enjoying good cheer and the banqueters seated in due order throughout the hall give ear to the bard. It is evident then that there's a certain kind of education that children must be given, not because it is useful or necessary, but because it is noble and suitable for a free person. The number of subjects involved, what they are, and how they should be taught, these are questions that must be discussed later on. So I got a lot of beef with this passage. I have a lot of beef with this passage because fundamentally it dissociates the work and the dignities of labor and wage labor from the pursuit of pleasure, and it secondarily subordinates the pursuit of wage labor to a set of ideological constructs that for their full reification in society depend on systemic and sustained exploitation. To be more direct about this, when we see Aristotle referencing Homer in this passage, and specifically the Homeric bard, a little digging will yield the insight that he is referring to Demodocus, the poet who sings for his supper at the court of the Phaeacians, the poet whose own production of art is directly aligned with exploitation. In other words, what is coming out from a considered reading of this passage's exhortation to pursue a kind of non-instrumentalized form of education is that for Aristotle and for those many who would follow in his footsteps, education is forever to be understood as the precinct of freedom for the privileged few who have access to the kinds of exploitation networks and who have access to the mechanisms for sustaining exploitation that make it possible for them to enjoy their pleasures at the expense of other people. This is what the core is teaching. So the question then becomes, what do we do about this? And as one of the guiding lights for my own reorientation around these texts, I come back to one of the passages that I read out to you earlier. There is no shame, as far as I'm concerned, in re-theorizing these and other texts, including those that we teach regularly in LitHum and CC, and in the many kinds of core-centered instruction that have grown out of Columbia's commitment to the core over the years, as inadequate to the tasks of our emancipation. So taking Aristotle as an example here, it's important to remember, first of all, that for all that we might be doing for students in centering Aristotle as the kind of author whom they can cite in cocktail conversations, what we must also do for them, especially if we are committed to building up towards a more responsible praxis of inclusion and emancipation, is show them that there are paths taken in our text that are irresponsible because they serve to justify the configuration of the academy as a site for the exploitation and for the perpetuation of exploitation in the 21st century. And crucially, that one of the major forms that this kind of valued exploitation takes is the denigration of labor and a failure to understand that labor is actually worthy of dignity and that labor should be accorded the humane protections that it has hitherto been denied by universities such as Columbia. So with that, I wrap up. I thank you very much for listening to me. And I hope that we'll continue this conversation. And I look forward to the other presenters as well.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Daniel. That was wonderful. And I'm really looking forward to talking more about that in the Q&A. I would like to, we'll continue with Priya, Sagar, and Avery Beard. Priya and Avery are currently undergraduate students at Columbia College. Avery is the Center Director for Education, and Priya is an Education Fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, a progressive policy think tank on campus, where they are working on an initiative called Decolonizing the Core, which they're here to speak about today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Priya and Avery, who I think have some slides, right?
Yes, just give me 1 minute or so I can, alrighty. Okay, sorry, technical issues. Okay. Wonderful. Is everyone able to see everything? Okay,
We can
perfect.
see.
Yeah, Avery, would you like to begin?
Yeah, hi. As Will mentioned, Priya and I are students in Columbia College right now, working with the Education Center at the Roosevelt Institute. We're so thankful to be speaking with you all today. And again, just want to express solidarity with you all as well, especially having learned from graduate instructors in my time at Columbia. The work that y'all do is so essential to this school, and you absolutely deserve adequate standards and dignity with your labor as well. We're so excited to talk about rethinking the core with you all today.
Hi, once again, as Will mentioned, I'm Priya, Priya Sagar. I'm an Education Center Fellow with the Roosevelt Institute at Columbia. And our initiative this year involves rethinking the core curriculum and what it really means to build a core that is for everyone. And one of the starting points that really got us thinking is this Martha Nussbaum quote: "Canon revision reveals the canon to be a social institution rather than a self-evidently sublime entity unsoiled by the grime of human interest." And one of the first things that we thought of as a group was the idea that the whole concept of a canon is inherently political. It frames our thinking and our understanding of the world around us, and it narrows our minds to see what is important and what isn't important, which is something that we need to keep in mind when we consider the core curriculum at Columbia itself and its reliance on the Western canon.
Yeah, so to begin, when we're discussing this with other students, we always begin with, why do we need to rethink the core? I think it can be easy, especially coming in here as an 18-year-old undergraduate, to just accept what the institution tells you is important and what you need to learn, and what you should accept as the requirements of a base knowledge. So Priya, if you go on to the next slide, the way that Columbia presents the core to incoming students, to undergraduates, to everyone in general who doesn't do a little bit more critical thinking, is that the core is an essential aspect of a well-rounded education. In order to be a well-rounded student, to think a lot about the world around you, need to learn all that the core teaches you. This quote comes directly from Columbia's website on the core curriculum. It's the cornerstone of the Columbia College education. The central intellectual mission of the core is to provide all students with wide-ranging perspectives on significant ideas and achievements in literature, philosophy, history, music, art, and science. However, when you look more deeply into the core, only 2 of the 18 semesters that a student must spend in the core must focus on areas outside of the West. When you do some math with that, I'm a humanities student, but we did the little percentages. That's only 11% of your time of the core that focuses on areas outside of the Western canon, and the core takes up a third of your time here at Columbia as a total. So Columbia is essentially subscribing to these undergraduate students that you must spend a very large chunk of your time here focusing solely on the Western canon. And as I'm sure many of you know, especially those of you who have taught the core, many of these texts feature ideas that have either been used to support or explicitly ascribe Western or white supremacy, whether that's the letters of Thomas Jefferson and Contemporary Civilizations, Nietzsche, Aristotle and natural slavery, things like that. So even when you look at the only non-Western Columbia core requirement, the global core, many of these global core suggestions that you can take, classes that fill the requirement, are directly related back to the West. They present areas outside of the West as simply another lens through which to view Western culture. Classes like Introduction to African American Studies, History of US East Asia Relations, the Quran in Europe are all amazing classes. But when offered as a global core, they show areas outside of the West as simply being elective or less important, ways for you to learn more about Western culture, not to learn for these cultures for the sake of learning about them on your own. So therefore, when Columbia describes the core as a wide-ranging education, they're really presenting the Western canon as the universal standard, and therefore as superior to any other pedagogies or canons or ways of learning. really an essential idea for us explaining this to other students is that the academy does not exist outside of the political hierarchy. It is not simply knowledge for the sake of knowledge. The academy produces and reproduces ways of thinking that both justify and create hierarchies of power, including race, class, and gender. So when we reproduce knowledge by creating a canon, we are often reifying these structures in ways that allow them to continue for years to come. That's why rethinking the core is so important.
So in regards to the problematic nature of a canon and specifically the Western canon and Columbia's reliance on that on building their core curriculum, we've come up with possible proposals for rethinking it. First of which would be creating an entirely new class, which would consist of smaller seminar style courses as part of the global core, mandating students to engage with this requirement with as much attention as they would give to lit hum or contemporary civilizations. And there would be different themes for different topics, from certain non-Western histories, philosophies, and narratives to colonization, decolonization, or oppression more generally. And this is not a new proposal at all. In 2007, there was a highly publicized hunger strike among undergraduate students demanding that the university create, once again, smaller seminar style global core courses that focused on these very themes. And the university did, in fact, concede to them, but they never put those concessions into practice. Once again, our global core classes are still very large and still evidently focused on the West. And these very demands are still persistent today in our meetings with different student groups, fielding opinions and understanding what the student body really would want in revising the core and really rethinking the core. We met with the first year student council, and one of their main focuses is diversifying faculty. And they expressed hope that the creation of a new course like this would compel the university to hire faculty from more diverse and at least within academia, underrepresented backgrounds. And in particular regards with graduate student workers, we know that we recognize that academia is is unfortunately a predominantly white field, and especially in the humanities, it's mostly available to those who have the means financially or otherwise to engage in that kind of career. And hopefully this would compel the university to look beyond that and to make it more accessible for those who aren't from those backgrounds, because the very focus of our classes do involve perspectives not necessarily belonging to more privileged backgrounds. Unfortunately, the main issue with this proposal is that while it is very popular, it is the least feasible for financial reasons. We do anticipate that the university administration would cite the expenses in hiring new faculty, needing more class space as a means to either compromise this proposal or reject it entirely. So that is something to keep in mind. But another proposal that we do have that is more feasible financially is revising existing syllabi. So past changes to the core have mostly come in the form of additions to the syllabus. For example, this year they've added Citizen and American Lyric as a rotational text. Students who are enrolled in Lit Hum can attest to having been assigned this over the summer. And these revisions would add more marginalized voices and narratives to both Lit Hum and CC. Historically, the administration has been much more receptive to these types of demands, and many revisions are made without student pressure in response to social trends as well. Again, as we saw with Citizen, this came in the wake of the resurgence in the Black Lives Matter movement. However, the quality of such additions would be entirely depending on the professor, many of whom are not experienced in teaching this type of content. So it's not just reading a text and that is in question here. It's how we engage with those texts. As once again, as we know, it's not just being exposed to certain content. It's really understanding it through a lens that isn't predominantly white, that isn't predominantly Western, and really breaking out of this idea of the Western canon. So I think that's all we really have in terms of our presentation, but if anyone has any questions or would like to learn more about our initiative, I'd be happy to, Avery and I would be happy to share our contact following this meeting or right now. If the hosts don't mind, if we could put our emails in the chat once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Priya and Avery. That was really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to talking more about this initiative and these various proposals. Yeah, please do put your emails in the chat if you'd like. People can get in touch. And we will move to our next presenter, who is Jason Resnikoff. Jason is a labor historian and a core lecturer in the history department, currently teaching contemporary civilization. As a graduate worker at Columbia, he served as a preceptor teaching CC, where he was awarded the Preceptor Award for teaching excellence in CC 2 years in a row. Wow, that's really impressive. He has taught the course to undergraduates in the college, the School of General Studies, and to incarcerated students at Taconic Correctional Facility. He was also a part-time UAW staff organizer from 2015 to 2017. His book, Labor's End: How the Promise of Automation Degraded Work, is coming out later this year. And today he'll be speaking about a talk called Trust Your Community, Labor, Democracy, and Contemporary Civilization. So thanks for being with us, Jason.
Oh, no, thank you folks so much for inviting me. It's really an honor to come and speak at a picket line. You know, it's like as a labor historian, you write about history, but you folks are making history. So it's a privilege to be able to be present with you here, and as well the other panelists. So, you know, forgive me if I sometimes, first of all, don't let me go on too long, obviously. You know, I have my timer here for 10 minutes, but sometimes I get very excited talking about these issues. And at the same time, I almost feel like I need to apologize at the outset. I do teach CC. I almost feel like, you know, or talk about the core, having won an award for teaching the core is almost damning, you know, I must, you know, shows my alliances lie. But to the contrary, it's very exciting to be able to talk about both labor rights and the core today. Because my basic gist, the argument is not going to be particularly radical, and I imagine many of us would already agree at the outset, but that the problem with the core is also the problem with Columbia, which is an absence of democracy. And therefore, I see the solution being something that, in fact, the GWC is doing right now, that the fight for more democracy at Columbia's campus, and just how the campus runs, and for labor rights, would also be how we could reform the core, right? Because the core is a thoroughly undemocratic institution. Its lack of democracy is literally written in stone on campus. And so a tectonic shift is going to be necessary. And what that fight would look like is in fact what we're seeing at this very moment. This is what that fight looks like. So it's another reason it's so exciting to talk about these things. So the other thing about being a labor historian is you spend your time going through archives and looking essentially at people's garbage. You know, you're going through things that people have thrown out to find voices that have been marginalized and suppressed. So sometimes I wonder this is going to be too nitty gritty. And so interrupt me or ask questions whenever it seems to be going in one direction or another. So I will say this. What is going on right now with the graduate fight for labor rights is a hallmark of the story of the last quarter of the 20th century and into the early 21st century, which is accelerating labor degradation in many professions, and especially white collar, quote unquote, white collar professions, whether it's journalism, whether it's teaching, even to a certain extent, medicine. And so the fight for labor rights at Columbia is in fact a way of trying to protect what a labor historian would call a job classification. And the story of grad workers teaching in the Corps, and someone like me, a Corps lecturer, who's basically a postdoc who does not have the right to join a postdoc union, is examples of people who are fighting to protect the essence of the job. And an important part of labor history, I keep saying this, but is when you fight for labor protections, you fight for job classifications, you're also fighting for the integrity of what that job means. And to be quite frank, workers' control. The hallmark of the Corps is a lack of workers' control in one's own teaching. And so I'm going to be very critical of the Corps for a moment, but the thing I want to say at the outset is I would not blame the faculty, even the tenured faculty. I have found that even the head of CC, Emmanuel Sada, has been very sympathetic to the grad worker union, and that the changes we are talking about are much deeper, much more structural than asking faculty to change their minds about X, Y, or Z. It's an actual redistribution of power that's necessary to change this curriculum. So, all right. I have to say a few things to you at the outset before I keep going, which is that I was a grad worker. I was a preceptor in the union. And at one point before, I think maybe just after the union election, I was asked as a 6th or 7th year grad worker, and Columbia was arguing that there were no 6th or 7th year grad workers. This was Columbia's argument about why they should not be allowed in the bargaining unit. So the union asked me to go down to the Javits Center, the federal building, to sit in the courtroom where the union lawyer was fighting with Columbia's many lawyers, Proskauer and Rose. It just is to physically be there to prove that grad workers existed in their 6th and 7th years. So I was just sitting there, waving, and the vice provost showed up, Christopher Brown, and he was like, surprised. He said, "Oh my God, here's one of our grad students." And that kind of denial of the existence of grad worker labor is so characteristic of Columbia University. I'm really grateful to Elizabeth for just showing us the numbers about how essential grad worker labor is to the functioning of this university. And so there are a few things I'm going to say. And I could go a little bit on about contemporary civilization specifically, what its formation has been, and also how it's reacted to recent, what we might call crises in the academy, specifically, for example, the Black Lives Matter protests and the pandemic, because I think there's a lot to see in this. But before I do that, a quick history lesson about contemporary civilization. And I hope I'm not treading on anyone's feet. We're going to talk about this later. But CC was the first core course. And it debuted actually in 1918. It was called War Aims. It was basically a propaganda course for the Woodrow Wilson administration. This is why we're fighting this great war. And then in the following course was called appropriately Peace Aims. And then in 1919, this course was turned into Contemporary Civilization, and every first year had to take it. And the oldest text that people read in Contemporary Civilization in 1919 dated from 1871. CE, not BC, CE. Like that was the oldest thing that anyone read. It's from the last quarter of the 19th century, because the idea was these were the skills that young men needed if they were going to rule the worlds of politics and business. And it wasn't until after World War II that any texts from antiquity were brought into at least the CC syllabus. Right. So, and in fact, in the 1920s, CC was cross-listed as today's problems. That's what they called the course when it wasn't called Contemporary Civilization. And the reason I'm mentioning this is, one, to show how the recent vintage of this, and also to point to directions we could take the course if we wanted to change it, right? It wouldn't be undermining what the idea of the core was actually by saying that the course needs to be perhaps built not around some idea of great white men, passing the baton of culture forward in time, but rather structured around issues, structured around contemporary issues. And I find that when the course works today, it's usually because an instructor is making a very conscious effort to actually restructure the course that way. When you're talking about Aristotle, you're really talking about labor rights or racism, or et cetera. And so if the core were just to embrace that, I think we could get much farther, much faster. So another thing that needs to be said about the history of the core is that it wasn't really until the 1930s, at least with contemporary civilization, that great books were brought into the shaping of the core curriculum. Beforehand, it had just been like, this is how New York City's water system works, and this is how you get run for mayor in New York, very nitty gritty stuff. But the person who pushed for the introduction of great books into CC was one of these famous professors, John Erskine. And he argued this. He said that the idea of bringing great books into a course like CC was in order to, quote, create the basis for an intellectual life in common. And specifically, he had in mind that this course was conscientiously going to help the children of immigrants become American or become Western. That was the idea. These were young people whose education did not inform them about how great Shakespeare was, for example. And so much of this was not just to educate young waspy men, but in fact, people whose parents came from, quote, the non-West, although often still Europe, make no mistake. And here I have to tell a small anecdote. My father matriculated at Columbia in 1960 from Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, where he was born, right? An incredibly Jewish household. And his first language was English. But his first year at Columbia, he had to take a speech pathology class because he did not speak English correctly, which I find to be insane. You know, it's like, I really, and now he's still very self-conscious about it. I talk like a normal person. So he didn't sound like his parents had been Yiddish speakers. And so I think that is definitely something that was actually somewhat of a later accretion into the core, but continues to be a part of its mission, right? To turn people into Westerners. And I think that's also where much of our criticism will come into it. And so now to talk a little bit about labor, and I want to get into this. So part of labor degradation, obviously, has been, like I said, the declassification of jobs. So we know, thankfully, we have the numbers here, that grad workers do a great deal of the labor for actually making this course go. And in fact, that's essential to, I mean, as Priya and Avery were pointing out, it's only with graduate laborers that CC could even exist. You need a certain amount of degraded labor to make this course go. Other courses, for example, if you were to go to University of Wisconsin, where you have these big introductory lectures, those are relatively cheap. But to have a seminar for every single undergraduate, 2 years running, you just need cheap labor. And the way you do this is, of course, what any employer would do, but is by mixing different kinds of workers together. So we know about graduate workers. And of course, the other thing that's so interesting about this is that graduate laborers do a lot more work than simply teach these courses. I imagine many of the preceptors here could speak to this, but most of us, and definitely for lecturers as well, like me, you have to sit through a briefing from psychological services where they tell you what to look for when, you know, undergraduates are suffering. I mean, they are definitely with the pandemic. And we are told that we are, quote, the first line of defense. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've never had any social services training of any kind. We're expected to do a lot of other kinds of care work. And a lot of this falls to grad workers, not just in the core, but definitely in pretty much every other place where you have teaching assistants. There's nothing to say about research assistants too, who often have to do this kind of work as well. And so there's a lot of extra work that's assumed that, you know, because we're younger or something, we're more adept at doing these things. But the way I find it is that there's more responsibility often put on the shoulders of graduate workers, and yet for less pay, and often we're entirely ignored. So the other thing that I would like to bring in with all of this is that, you know, maybe I should just underline this now before I keep going, which is that, of course, that the core requires vulnerable semi-cheap labor to work, but also that most of the people who make the core work have very little control over what the core is, which brings me to like the main thing I'm trying to hammer home today, which is that if one were to succeed and to imagine rebuilding the core from the ground up, it would have to be along democratic means. So I can give you another example from what happened during the Black Lives Matter peak in protests in 2020. And this is like an immediate snapshot into what was going on in the summer before all these workers came back, you know, on Zoom. And that was, we, you know, our very capable and I think very well-intentioned leader of CC sent out an email saying, what should we do to react, to you know, acknowledge that BLM is happening now in our classrooms. And what was so difficult was there weren't many options to do so without retooling the course completely. And this is the most damning criticism of CC that I can imagine. Of course, I should say, I actually very much like teaching, but nevertheless feel very divided over for just this reason. And the solution that the core office came up with was that we'd create a new mini unit at the very beginning of the year where we'd read a few texts, mainly by authors, people of color. So something by Kwame Appiah, something by Frederick Douglass, something by Martin Luther King Jr. And while I thought this was better than nothing, it was almost not better than nothing because it's very, very little. And in fact, by bringing in one unit at the very beginning of the year to try to recast reading in Plato and Aristotle and all that, for all the criticisms that Donnell made that were so right on, is really not going to do it. And so there's not a lot of wiggle room within, I think, the core to actually take these things seriously, even when you have leaders who do wish to take it seriously. So I'll end by saying a few things that, and I know, I hope I'm not going on and on this, but I do believe, well, I should say rather, I don't believe that Columbia's administration as presently constituted will ever trust its community adequately enough to actually take what it wants into consideration. Everywhere you go at Columbia, everywhere you turn, it proves its deep distrust of its own people. And in fact, its distrust of democracy in general. And so I would say a way of going forward with the core would in fact be not only to embrace democracy as a way of actually structuring Columbia's campus, but a way of recontextualizing core texts, which is something that right now the core takes some pride in, that it reads texts as radically decontextualized. And I think you don't even necessarily need to throw out Aristotle, but you could rather contextualize him in his uses. And it'd be very, very useful for individuals to see how the slave power of the 1850s used Aristotle, for example. And instead of organizing it chronologically to create a false sense and recreate the idea of the West in these classrooms. When we say we're going to be critical of them, but we actually just build it in those classrooms. It's very frustrating for conscientious instructors who don't want to do that. The obvious conclusion that an undergraduate would come to is that there is a thing called Western civilization. Rather, if we were to return the core to the idea of today's problems, for example, I think we could get much, much farther, much faster. And I feel like I must be out of time right now. So yeah, I'm already 12 minutes over. So okay, I'll end it right there. Thank you again. And I hope we get to talk about this more. So.
Thank you so much, Jason. That was there's a lot there. And wow, what a story about your dad. Thank you so much. So we're having a slight shuffle in order. We just have two more speakers, but we're next going to have Rads Mehta speak. And Rads is currently a junior in Columbia College, double majoring in neuroscience and economics. And as a queer student of color, she found the Lit Hum curriculum, a course meant to teach the human experience to be incredibly unrepresentative of the many issues facing her and her peers today. So in the fall of 2019, she co-led the Butler Banner Project, in which a 140-foot banner bearing the names of 8 women of color writers and visionaries was hung from the top of Butler Library to directly juxtapose with the names of the 8 white men that Columbia's core curriculum idolizes. The banner remained there for the duration of the fall semester and was accompanied by a series of over 25 events, ranging from faculty lectures to a Wikipedia edit-a-thon with the CEO of Wikimedia. As she heads into her final year at Columbia, she continues to advocate for greater diversity in the core curriculum. So thanks for being with us here today, Rads.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for that introduction, Will. Can you guys hear me okay? I know there's a little bit of background noise where I am. You guys are good? Okay, great. So I'm just going to start off by going into a brief introduction about why the project came about, and then also talk a little bit about my work on student council in trying to diversify the core. And then I'll kind of go back to some of the things that Jason brought up so wonderfully about solutions moving forward and what I think the best thing is to advocate for as we all try to continue along this path. And first of all, thank you so much for the other speakers. You guys have been so inspirational, and it's been great to hear about all of your thoughts and everything that you've been doing. So 30 years ago, a group led by Laura Hotchkiss Brown, who was a GS student at the time, hung a banner with the names of 8 female writers: Sappho, Marie de France, Christine de Pizan, Sor Juana Inez de la Cruz, Bronte, which was intended to cover Charlotte, Emily, and Anna Bronte, Emily Dickinson, and Virginia Woolf. Her and the other students who hung the banner from Butler Library were arrested, and their banner was quickly taken down. This project was then reiterated again about 5 years later, where another group of Columbia students put together a homemade banner and again tried to hang that from the top of Butler Library, and they too faced similar consequences. On December 9th, 2018, underneath the names of Homer, Herodotus, Sophocles, Plato, Aristotle, Demosthenes, Cicero, and Virgil, Julian von Abel, CC 21, yelled at a group of Black students screaming, "White people are the best thing that happened to that world, and that white people built modern civilization." It's not just that these names are on our buildings, these spaces carry weight on our campus, and the names on our buildings, the names taught in our curriculums, and the names that are espoused in our classrooms and by our faculty have a huge bearing on what Columbia students take away is the way that they should view the world and the way that they should treat their peers. 4 months later, across the street, a student was pinned down against the counter by public safety officers in Milstein Library for not showing his identification when he entered Barnard's campus, a school that receives its name from a slave-owning family. These libraries are more than just buildings, and the names etched onto their facades are more than just tributes to wealthy donors. They are constant yet subtle reminders of the values of their respective institutions. Every time someone walks past Butler, they see the names of these 8 white men, and internalize that these are the writers and thinkers that Columbia deems deserving of cultural admiration and important to our institutional values. When the core curriculum was first designed 100 years ago, the demographics of Columbia's student body matched those of the writers they read, white men. But when you take a look around the student, when you take a look around your peers, around the students that you're teaching, Columbia is one of the most diverse universities in this country. Over 50% of the undergraduate student body identifies as a person of color, and the newly admitted class of Barnard, they actually admitted over 64% students of color. In these classes in Lit Hum and CC, we read literature to better understand the human experience. And as Will mentioned in my introduction, as a person of color, the text read in Lit Hum and in CC struggle to discuss the themes and ideologies central to the way that I view and interact with this world and the way that my peers view and interact with this world. If Columbia is trying to best prepare their students for life beyond graduation, they should be teaching their students texts about the cultures and identities from around the world, from the makeup of Columbia, and more importantly, and also the makeup of New York City. We act as if we're in this little bubble where these are the people that we're espousing, and Columbia has been able to get away with that for so long, with this idea of the Western world being superior, and that's not the case, and that's also not the world that students are moving into when we think about the globalized version of the world we live in today. So in the spring of 2019, around 10 undergraduate students came together to discuss what names they felt belonged on Butler Library and as part of Columbia's institutional values. And that's an activity that I really suggest each of you do yourselves after this meeting, when you have some free time. Think back on what writers have been the most meaningful to you in your development into the person that you are today. Who was it that ended up having that big impact on the way that you think about the world, on the way that you view your life, on the way that you view the interactions that you have on a daily basis? And ask yourself what it is about these writers and about the experience that they shared and that they wrote about that had that impact on you. We chose the authors that we had chosen because we felt like the themes that they had written about reflected a lot of the aspects of the human experience that are not represented at all in the Western canon. So I'm happy to go into brief bios of all of the different 8 writers we chose, but one of them, A. Ravathi, discussed what it was like to go through a gender affirming operation. Another writer, Gloria Anzaldúa, talked about what it meant to live on the border. And Ntozake Shange, who was a student at Barnard, wrote about the experiences that Black girls growing up in America go through. But for us, the project was also so much more about just names on the banner. It was about inspiring conversations and building consciousness about the values being espoused by Columbia and the Western society and the Western canon as a whole. And so while the banner was taken down in January 2020, our hope was that the spirit of the project would live on, and that every time that you walk past Butler Library and you see all of those different names that are etched onto Butler, and I don't know if you guys have noticed, but there are those 8 main names, and then there's another row below them that circles the building. None of those names, even on the second row, are of women. All of those are men. And there's actually some really interesting stuff in the archives that shows, you can see the correspondences between Butler and the designers of the library as they decided what name should be on. They even had more, but then there was a comment about how it looked too much like a telephone book. So some of the men were cut, and this was the trimmed down version of the list. So I quickly want to give you guys a brief bio on each of the writers, because I think they're all truly amazing. And before I go into that, I just want to say that while we were only able to choose 8 writers because of the juxtaposition that we were doing between the banner and the 8 big names on Butler Library, we had so many submissions from students on campus of writers that they felt belonged on the library. And even after the banner was up, we had constant emails in our inbox of like, hey, like, did you consider this writer? Like, hey, when there's another banner, like, would you guys put this one on? And I think just to me, seeing that there were so many students that were like, hey, like, there are so many other people that are deserving of having this pedestal on campus was really exciting. And those are the types of conversations that I think we should be continuing to have in our classrooms, at the lunch table, etc. So our first writer was Maya Angelou, who I'm sure all of you guys have heard of. She's an internationally acclaimed writer whose unique and powerful voice became a poignant record of the Afro-American female experience. As a young woman in the Jim Crow South, whose childhood was marred by sexual abuse and racism, the odds were stacked against her success. Nonetheless, her debut book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, became a bestseller upon its publication in 1969. And despite attempts to censor the book due to its description of the trauma the author suffered, it remained a centerpiece of 20th century literature. She famously read her poem on the pulse of the morning at President Bill Clinton's inauguration and won a Grammy Award for its recording. Her work continues to touch the lives of countless readers around the world, and she will be remembered as a towering figure of the 20th century literature for years to come. The next writer is Gloria Anzaldúa, who was a writer, poet, and feminist theorist. Anzaldúa's work focuses on her experience as a queer Chicana woman and her childhood on the Mexico-Texas border, as well as themes of marginalization in culture and identity. Anzaldúa was born on September 26, 1942 in the Rio Grande Valley and grew up moving around southern Texas. Some of her notable works include her essay La Prieta, published in 1981, color in a country dominated by homophobia and racism. Other works of Anzaldúa include The Bridge Called My Back, writings by radical women of color, which Anzaldúa co-edited with Sherry Moraga, who has done events previously at Barnard, and Light in the Dark, Luz en lo Oscuro, Rewriting Identity, Spirituality, Reality, which was published posthumously in 2015. Sorry, my screens are keep moving. Diana Chang was the next writer, and she was a Chinese-American novelist, poet, educator, and author. She was born in New York City in 1924, though her family later moved to China where she was raised. And a lot of her work involved investigating how her birth in America and then her subsequent move to Shanghai ended up influencing a lot of her life. And she also attended Barnard College and graduated in 1949 with a bachelor's in creative writing. Her debut novel, The Frontiers of Love, was the first novel to have been written by an American-born Chinese American in the United States. And she later returned to Barnard in 1979 as an adjunct associate professor, teaching creative writing for 10 years, and later an art history course titled Imagery and Form in the Arts for 5 years. Her writing was strongly influenced by ethnicity and identity in society, but she notably explored themes of identity beyond race and her own personal experience, contributing both universal and unique perspectives to the literature. The next writer is another Barnard alum, Dora Neale Hurston, a New York City alum. And so my screens are moving, I apologize, guys. But she played a critical role in the history of Black literature and ethnographic study through her work dealing with African-American life, the Harlem Renaissance, Black womanhood, and Haitian spirituality. After enrolling at Harvard University, she did decide to transfer to Barnard College in 1925, and she was the first Black student to enroll in Barnard during the Great Migration and at the height of the Harlem Renaissance. Although Hurston was allowed to live on campus with her white peers, she wasted no time in getting acclimated to the college and New York City. And you can read a lot of her thoughts on what it was like to be at Barnard and to be working in the anthropology department. Alice Walker wrote about Hurston's impact on Black literature in her article in Search of Dora Neale Hurston. And if it weren't for Alice Walker, her legacy might have actually been wiped from the history books. The next writer is actually in the Lit Hum curriculum. She was one of the most recent additions, Toni Morrison. And she was a celebrated American author who wrote novels on themes central to the lives of African Americans throughout the course of history and into the present. She was also awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama in 2012. And that's an honor that's given to those who've made especially meritorious contributions to the security or national interests of the United States, to world peace, or to cultural or other significant public or private endeavors. She was also the first Black woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. And in June 2016, that's when Columbia added Morrison's Song of Solomon to the Western Masterpieces of Literature and Humanities curriculum, making Morrison the first Black author to be added to the syllabus. A. Revathi is one of the least known writers on the banner, and she's an activist and writer who focuses on transgender and gender identity and the rights of LGBTQ plus minorities. Before the pandemic, we were planning to fly Revathi out to do a performance at Columbia, and obviously that was canceled because of the pandemic, but we're hoping to be able to do something with her in the future. She was born in Tamil Nadu, India, and when she grew up, she felt disconnected from her gender and acting in a manner traditionally considered to be feminine. She explores everything, including her sex change operation, her sex work, and all the treatment that she was forced into bearing in her memoir called The Truth About Me, A Here's Your Life Story, which I highly recommend that all of you read. The next writer, Ntozake Shange, who I mentioned earlier, was born Paulette Williams, and she was an African-American playwright and poet who is mostly known for her award-winning choreo poem for colored girls who've considered suicide, Thus When the Rainbow Is Enough. And she also was a Barnard alum who graduated with a bachelor's in American Studies. When recalling her time at Barnard, Shange explained that, I feel as though I came of age as a feminist and an artist at Barnard. I formed the basis of my critical thinking in English and history classes. I was a member of conscious raising groups, the anti-war movement and the Black student movement, and I got all that I ever imagined from an all-women's college, and I thought my archives belonged here at Barnard. All of her journals are in the Barnard archives and are accessible to students. I don't know how that's working in the pandemic, but if you're interested, I do highly recommend. And then the last, again, I'm sorry for all the bios. I highly recommend that you guys look into this. And I know someone dropped a link to the website in the chat, which also has links to a lot of their works and stuff like that. The last writer was Leslie Marmon Silko, and she was an American essayist, poet, and novelist. She's a Laguna Pueblo, Euro-American, and Mexican-American heritage, and is known for writing about individuals of Native American heritage and mixed ancestry. Growing up on the edge of the Laguna Pueblo reservation, Silko was prohibited from participating in Pueblo tribal rituals and joining Pueblo religious societies, but she still learned the traditions from female family members as a child. She has been identified as one of the most influential Native American writers of our generation and has been described as a member of the first wave of what scholar Kenneth Lincoln has termed the Native American Renaissance. Some of her more notable works are Ceremony and Storytellers, but there are many others. So those were the 8 writers that we had chosen. Again, as Will mentioned, I'm a neuroscience and economics student, so many of these writers are not ones that I had read myself, but it was a committee of students who went through a lot of their works and looked into these writers and chose them because they came from such different backgrounds and really had a lot of the experiences that we felt like were important to be talked about in the classroom. And so along when we were putting up the banner and we were running these events, I had a lot of meetings with the director, the dean of the core. I sat on the committee for the core curriculum last year, which contains the dean of the core, the dean of academic affairs, along with the chairs of each department. And it was constantly brought up, how can we diversify these curriculums? How can we better have these curriculums be representative of what the student body wants? And I think, as Jason mentioned, it's really, really hard to do that. I think going back to the example that Jason brought up about the BLM unit that was put into the beginning of CC, I had friends who were in those sections and they felt like the BLM unit was even worse than not having one at all, because the big problem is that there are so many CC professors who just do not have the experience needed to teach those works, and who a lot of students felt like did not put in the effort to understand what those writers were trying to convey, who did not understand how to best teach those works, who did not understand how to talk about those themes in the classroom, and in fact, look to students of color, primarily Black students in the class, to talk about their life experiences and explain the works to the other students. And that is unacceptable. That burden should not fall on students of color to be trying to help the teachers because they have not had the training and they have not done the work themselves to teach those works in the classroom. And I think as we move forward and talk about ways to go forward, we need to make sure that we are not tokenizing writers. That's another thing that was a big critique of when Toni Morrison was first added to the Lit Hum curriculum, is that professors who are well-versed in ancient Greek literature did not do the work needed to know how to best teach Song of Solomon in the classroom. And students felt like they could tell the difference of having Song of Solomon at the end of the year, and it felt like it was just a Band-Aid that had been put on to say, hey guys, we have some diversity in the curriculum now. And so I think it's incredibly important that as we add new texts with new writers to the curriculum, we're not just adding the text, we're also really training professors on how to teach those and making sure that everyone is aware and feels safe in the classroom. And so even having ways and talking to professors about how to have productive conversations, I think is really important. And then the last thing I'll say, because I think I'm also running over time, I got too carried away with the bios of the writers, was that I think, as Jason mentioned, one of the best ways is to recontextualize text. And so something that some, I know, Lit Hum professors have been doing is bringing in texts from diverse authors into the classrooms and putting them in conversation with Plato, with Aristotle, and saying, okay, let's read this article, let's read something by Dr. King, and now let's talk about how those things relate and how we can have all these ideas in the classroom at once. But thank you so much please feel free to reach out to me if you guys have any questions. If you have any ideas, I will continue to be on student council next year, and I'm more than happy to put you guys in touch with any administrators. I think all the ideas here are really good, and I think, unfortunately, the only way to move forward is getting the administration to agree that we need to build these curriculums from the ground up. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you so much, Rads. That was really wonderful. And I can just attest, when I first taught literature humanities the first year, the banner was up, and it was just such an important architectural reminder to have up there, and that architecture matters, the built environment matters. Our final speaker is Zoe Dostal, who is a Columbia PhD student in the art history department and a current instructor within art humanities. Her dissertation addresses questions of labor, gender, and textile manufacturing in relation to 18th century British art. She is also a co-organizer of Art and Social Justice, a graduate student initiative in the art history department that currently focuses on the intersection of the humanities and mass incarceration. You can see their inaugural exhibition, Stories in Paper, an exhibition of works by incarcerated artists, on the 8th and 9th floors of this Skirmerhorn Hall on Columbia's campus. So thank you, Zoe.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this, and thank you to all of the wonderful speakers. I think you'll see a lot of resonances in what I have to say with what's already been said, but hopefully can bring a perspective from art humanities, which I think, along with the music humanities, is talked about a bit less in relation to the core. I'm just going to share my screen with my PowerPoint. Okay. You'll see why I titled this The Shoulds and Coulds of Art Humanities. So for this talk, I looked through the archives of The Spectator and how they covered art humanities and kind of the core in general over time. And it pulled out some interesting quotes and articles and really found, there's this central tension of the core, which is the question of should, right? And I thought that this quote captured it well. Given the option, would you take it? Maybe not, but should you take it? I think so. And throughout this talk, by the end, I want to transition from the shoulds of art hum and the core to maybe the coulds of the core. So the origins of art hum, there's parts of it that originate in the 1930s, and then it became solidified over the 1940s. But I thought this quote from an article in 1948 was interesting. Early in 1934, a group of Columbia professors who had already made educational history by promoting the famed CC courses plotted in clandestine fashion for the humanities A and B, the original names of art and music hum. They felt, as they had in the case of the contemporary civilization courses, that a college which granted a liberal arts degree should produce educated men, and that as such, these men should have a taste of the arts. We've already talked a lot about how the core is rooted in white supremacy and the patriarchy, but I think seeing it written out sort of in these ways is really helpful as well. And of course, what are the shoulds of these of producing educated men? I mean, there's this, I don't know if this circulates in the rest of the core, just art humanities, but sort of this tale that really this is supposed to be fodder for cocktail parties, or to create like a shared language with your Columbia alumni. So what is art hum? It's a series of monuments and artists that are considered culturally significant. It used to be called masterpieces of fine arts. Recently, that was changed to masterpieces of Western art, which at least explicitly acknowledges, to a certain degree, culturally significant to whom, although I'll return to that idea. But this is, according to the History of Art Hum on the Art History Department website, some key components of one of the earliest syllabi. You had the Parthenon, an unnamed Gothic cathedral, Raphael, Michelangelo, Rembrandt, Picasso, Frank Lloyd Wright, and then, I don't know, the skyscraper as a concept, I'm not sure. And we'll really see, like, this hasn't largely changed for most of art hum's history, a similar theme with all of the core. But there were, of course, many debates about how the curriculum should change. And I really recommend looking it up in full. I had a really hard time pulling out quotes. This is a wonderful article from 1982, Profs Defend Core as Timeless. And this came out the year before women started coming to Columbia. And so I'll read a few quotes because I think it really pulls out the central questions of why it is so hard to change the core. Life in the college classroom will change next fall, and the anticipated presence of women has prompted discussion of alternative approaches to conducting the course. Most of these discussions center on new teaching techniques rather than the addition of new works to accommodate women, because women and therefore their creative attempts have been buried by a history which is a history of men. They could not author the type of masterwork that belongs on a core syllabus, said a professor of philosophy who taught the core. So of course, this is bringing up the question already of the core has to be about masterpieces, but of course, masterpieces are an artificial construct, right? Determined by institutions, collectors, and early 20th century Euro-American institutions like Columbia. Basically, Columbia has determined what masterpieces are. So another quote, but college administrators and instructors in all courses said the core could never be temporally or sexually biased because its traditional works are, quote, timeless. Its curricula had the capacity to respond to contemporary issues as they arise. I do believe, as Danelle said, we need to put, whatever we're teaching historically in dialogue with the contemporary, but this idea of timeless is really dangerous, right? Of course, art texts are rooted in a particular time and context, and it's, white supremacist patriarchal idea that some works are so great that they can transcend these limitations and be for all people, of course, who's making those decisions, a small group with only themselves in mind. Others maintain that if the core addresses all students' needs, it becomes a survey course imbued with automatic superficiality. Students can gain access to more contemporary works and works by women in other courses, faculty members said. I mean, that quote, all students' needs, needs is already a big question for me, but then of course, all students, yes, God forbid, it addresses the needs of any students other than that original identified elite male student that seems to be the ideal student for the core throughout its history, supposedly. This is my favorite because I think this is going to really strike home for everyone who's been to bargaining sessions lately. Mechanical problems such as lack of time for faculty to consider curricular additions to the difficulty of reaching staff consensus about which modern or women authored works to include also inhibit changes to the core, instructors and administrators said. This kind of bureaucratic administrative excuse. And I heard what Jason was saying about, don't entirely blame the professors. There's much deeper forces at play here. And I do think that that's true. But I also think, this is for everything kind of at Columbia that can't change the go-to excuse of it would be really hard. And it would be really difficult to have these conversations, reach consensus, be fair. We don't have the time for that. And then finally, I had to pull out this quote pertinent to Art Hum in particular, but Howard McP. Davis, professor of art history and Art Hum instructor since 1955, said that he did not believe he would have to alter his approach when women arrived because, quote, I already discussed the presentation of women in art. So, he is referring to presumably nude women in art, unnamed women in art, women who are receptacles in canvases, their bodies are the canvas for male creativity, right? Of course, why actually introduce women as creators? So again, I really refer you accessing the archive on that one. So this is just a comparison to see, of course, there were small changes between 1941 and 2019, and I'm not demonstrating all of them here because I'm being quite reductive in this short presentation, but you can see in the comparison of 1941 to 2019, obviously time progressed, modern art became a thing. So they introduced Pollock and Warhol and Bernini, Goya, Monet, but things largely remained the same until this year. So this, for those who don't know, is the first year that we're teaching the new official Art Hum syllabus. And there are now 7 white women and 2 people of color, both Black men, who are on the official curriculum. And so just to wrap up with a couple things to say about this, first, it was a massive effort to accomplish this reform. So graduate students had been advocating for this reform, any reform, for years. And it got to the point where graduate students were essentially teaching their own syllabi. Graduate students jeopardized relationships with professors and their standing in the department. And finally, a couple years ago, these changes were really fought for and pushed through by a committee of professors and graduate students led by the current Art Hum chair. And then faculty and predominantly graduate students put in a huge amount of labor writing lesson plans to essentially reteach Art Hum to everyone, the professors, preceptors. And I think it's really critical, therefore, that in celebrating this reform, which should be celebrated to a certain degree, these many years of unpaid, unacknowledged labor, I don't even know how far back, has to be recognized. It was graduate student demand informed by what their undergraduate students were demanding that created the reform. And of course, this reform isn't enough. So as you can see, this was an additive approach. That means that every woman and person of color is paired with a white man. This course is still about masterpieces, in itself an outdated and fraught concept. The title, Masterpieces of Western Art, is better, but what do we mean by Western? You know, we really mean white, wealthy, Christian, urban. The entire syllabus is centered in Western Europe, primarily in urban centers like London, Paris, and Rome, and New York. And honestly, art is a really tricky idea because in this class, we only learn about painting, sculpture, and architecture. We have one class on printmaking. We don't even learn about photography officially. And this elitist definition of art is derived from European academies of the 17th and 18th centuries, and it's extremely exclusionary. So I'll just say, you know, teaching this class is a balancing act, as many have referred to, between embracing and critiquing or counter-teaching, as Dostal said, what is on the syllabus. And I know that in the very first class, many graduate instructors have students start deconstructing the title, Masterpiece Western and Art. And I want to, like, as an art historian, I don't think that we should throw out Art Hum. You know, as an art historian, I believe that everyone should learn about art. What art is a different question. How is another question. But I think that, you know, Columbia has a particularly strong art history program at a time when it's declining all over the country. Tenure tracks are not being renewed. But we are really fortunate because we have Art Hum. Our classes are oversubscribed, which is incredible. So yeah, so there's this idea of what could Art Hum be? What could it do? I do think, you know, the new emphasis in Art Hum on visual literacy is really important, but I think we're at a place where we can now really think further and think about the kinds of questions that Art Hum could answer, such as how is selfhood constructed through representation? Or, you know, what is the relationship of art and labor? Art played a huge role in labor movements. And I think structuring Art Hum by questions rather than individuals and masterpieces is one potential exciting way forward. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Zoe, and yeah, and to all of our speakers. And I apologize as organizers, the timekeeping, we've run a little bit over time here. I know some people may be having to run to the general body meeting right now that's happening with the union. However, the Picket captains have informed me that we are okay to stay on the Zoom a little bit longer if so we can have just a little bit of Q&A. And speakers, let's just have one big round of applause for everybody so much right now. Thank you so much for this. This was so informative, so interesting. Many people have already said that these conversations need to continue and they will continue. But yeah, I don't know if Nolan, if you wanted to just lead off, I know you already put a question in the chat, but would you like to just sort of ask that question?
Sure. I think I'll just reiterate it. I don't actually have more to add. Just want to amplify the two comments by Rads near the end of the presentation and Dan L at the very beginning of our teach-in, which is a question about, you know, the labor of emancipatory change, and Dan L saying, you know, there is no shame here. We move from, in the quote, it was from humble to humiliated, and how to, you know, sort of be brave and collaborative rather than subscribe to or get lost in shame, while also not simply putting extra pressure on our most marginalized students, graduate students, and faculty to sort of be the push for these changes. So that's the sort of tension that I want to think about. I hope that's clear. I think it's actually more clear in my comment on the chat than it was just now.
I think that so Rad's had to run, but I don't know if Daniel, if you would like to speak to that question or comment or.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is one of the challenges moving forward is going to be to grapple with the many ways in which emancipatory reform is affectively mediated through shame. And this is, I think, endemic in academic settings and in other settings too. I mean, the work that affect and that professionalized affects of this sort seek to accomplish is precisely the one that you had flagged in your comment. It's to sort of force those who are in the position of advocating for change to feel as if they are causing discomfort, to feel as if they are embarrassing others, and at the same time to condition those in positions of authority to react negatively to any sentiment of shame that they may feel, and to react violently towards any sentiment of shame that they may feel. And so among the most infuriating aspects of the discussions underway in context academic and para-academic as they pertain to labor has been the folding in of humiliation and shame into even the practice of advocating for one's humane treatment and dignity, right? To the comment itself, you know, and to Nolan's elaboration of it, I would just add that it's becoming sort of more and more obvious that much of the work that we have to do to reform things like the core is work that will have to attend quite carefully to the weaponization of affect as a way of keeping folks under control. And this ramifies on multiple directions, right? You know, I take Jason's reminder, you know, that we have to think about sort of systemic change very capaciously, very much to heart. And at the same time, I also reflect on my own complicities as a member of the faculty in sustaining structures and my own deployment of affects as ways of managing situations that are uncomfortable or of blunting the force of calls to reform, right? So, I mean, that's part of the work that I think does very much fall on the shoulders of faculty, not only faculty, of course, but it is work that we have to be prepared to undertake. Because if we don't undertake it, then we keep incentivizing our employers to manage exploitation and the sustainment of a precariat as preconditions for their viability into the 21st century. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, and thank you for staying over time, Nadal. I know you have parenting responsibilities in addition to your many other responsibilities, and but we're glad to have another.
Say hi.
Daddy.
Oh. Madeline.
Hi, thank you so much to everyone for all these presentations. It was really fascinating. This is maybe more of a general question, but so I'm a Barnard student, and I appreciated, I think it was Rads who mentioned, you know, that Barnard is named after a slaveholder, and I am not super, you know, a lot of these conversations have revolved around Columbia, but I think it was really important, especially to mention that Barnard's incoming class is so incredibly diverse, but I think Barnard has a lot of work to do still in its curriculum to support trans and non-binary students, for example, who are still like excluded in a lot of Barnard's language, and students of color as well. So I don't know if that's like, I mean, that's partly a comment, but also a question relating to labor, because I'm not quite as knowledgeable about Barnard's like practices relating to like undergraduate TAs, and whether their labor is exploited. So if anyone would like to comment on that, I would find that really useful.
Yeah, would any of the speakers like to speak to that comment in question?
I mean, I'll speak a little bit to the first point, just in terms of, yes, agreed. I mean, I think our department has been having a series of talks, for example, because also the graduate students at our department is working on admitting are increasingly diverse. But I think that institutions, recently I've been really enjoying Sarah Ahmed's work, for example, on this topic. Institutions are really good at working on, I mean, they're not that great. They need to obviously be better, and it's great that they're becoming better, but increasing admissions numbers and creating those kinds of statistics, which goes along sort of with like mission statement making, right? These things that are a first step. They're so much a first step, but but it requires a lot of follow-through actions to make sure that students are supported when they arrive on campus, not just through the curriculum in a whole variety of ways, and that chronically institutions are not very good at that and at that follow-through. And so I think the point you raise is incredibly important when talking about the core, in terms of talking about one of the key aspects, crucial aspects that's at stake in reforming the core is it is right, as many of the speakers brought up today, it is absolutely crucial to do this work inside out from in the university, not just outside in. So I think that was a really good point.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Jason?
I also know, and again, I don't know enough about undergraduate TAs at Barnard, but there's the contingent faculty union at Barnard as well. And so, which is like a parallel union, and there isn't one at Columbia, although they're in 2110 as well. So you have like different kinds of organizing going on. I was also wondering if I could raise a question myself, even though I was on the panel, which is that, and it's something, because I do feel divided on it. We didn't quite get into it, and perhaps this isn't the place, I don't know, which is that, I've been teaching CC, I have many issues with it, but I also find it useful, right? These are useful books to think with, for example. And I mean, Danelle raised this point as well, which is, I wonder what this community thinks about how much of the core to keep. Has the core being useful? I mean, I stay up at night thinking like, oh man, Aristotle's a monster. And yet like my counter teaching, he became very useful. And I think something that I hope I might not have said clearly enough, I actually think that a lot of graduate preceptors and many lecturers and many faculty as well work very hard to try to bring democracy into the way they teach these texts. It's not like we have an irresponsible group of instructors. And so I suppose I wonder what this group thinks of that tension, the utility of this thing, these instructors who take it seriously, but on the other hand, some serious structural problems. I mean, are we all agreed that we want to reform the core? Is anyone here calling for its abolition? Which is not something I would call for, but I wonder what you folks think.
An excellent provocation. Would anybody care to respond?
I don't mind responding. And Avery, you can hop in whenever you'd like. I personally can recall from a town hall that we recently had with students that one common concern was that there's no hope for a revised core without essentially tearing it down and starting all over again. And then on the flip side, there was also the perspective in which, why don't we keep all these texts, but inform students of the problematic historical contexts that exist in them. I'm not sure if I personally have a definite opinion on it, but I do think it's worth trying to find some form of reconciliation between the ideas. Avery, would you like to add anything?
Sure, yeah. I absolutely agree with Jason that it's a bit ironic since I am leading a thing on rethinking the core, but I actually really enjoy the core. And I think in a large part that's due to the instructors I've had who have really focused on looking at the core through a different lens and what these texts have done historically. Like the only reason why I know so much about how problematic Aristotle has become is my instructor focusing on the historical roots of the idea of natural slavery and things like that. But I've also heard sort of core horror stories from classmates of mine who did not have professors that were as focused on a critical or progressive lens. And just, for example, reading Virginia Woolf and bringing up the anti-Asian bias in there and having the professor be like, I didn't see that anywhere in the text. That can be really unaffirming as a student and make you feel like very gaslit in a way, especially when you're already so insecure about your role at an institution. I think pretty much everyone here has had like imposter bias and imposter syndrome of some sort. So I think the core can really play into that if it's not taught correctly. Not that I ever want to affirm the idea that there's one way to teach things or anything like that. But I do think that a lot of the feedback that Priya and I have gotten is that they enjoy the text, but would like instructors to be given some sort of track on how to teach them, if that makes sense, to focus on these ideas of diversity and representation and things like that.
Thank you for that answer. That was amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, I'm of two minds on this because on the one hand, I've derived a great deal of critical energy from relationships formed through teaching in the core and then teaching with core materials. In addition to my stint as a core instructor while I was at the Society of Fellows at Columbia, I've also come back to the core to give lectures to the core preceptors. And those have been rewarding for many reasons. At the same time, one of the issues that stands out for me is the inherent implicatedness of even doing counter-teaching work in circumstances where knowledge production reproduces the structures of exploitation that are centered in the text themselves. So, to revert to the Aristotle Book 8 example for a moment, there is plenty that one can do to excavate the sociocultural and historical underpinnings of Aristotle's position, and also to then bring those into dialogue with the demands of the present.
Hi.
At the same time, you're saying hi, yeah. At the same time, a text that is meditating on the construction of freedom through leisured intellectual practice sits uneasily at best with a condition of exploitation in which the majority of core preceptors are contingent or precarious. Because what exactly is happening in that classroom, among other things, it is the reenactment of the knowledge industry as conditional on the leisured delectation of students who are benefiting from the inadequately compensated labor of their instructors. And that's only to skim the surface. I mean, we could spin other accounts of like the kinds of exploitation that become evident in this kind of setting. So I keep wrestling with this in other contexts outside of the core. The other week in a seminar that I'm teaching to undergrads at Princeton, I had occasion to revisit an author whom I really dislike, Hegel, and we taught the section in the appendix to his lectures on world history, in which he describes Africa as being out of history, right? It's a notorious section, one that various Hegelian apologists have tried to dismiss for various reasons over the past few years. But one of the things I invited students to do in our conversation was to reflect on how my institution and others like it, like Columbia, reproduce the exclusion of Africa out of history. So like we are still actually living in Hegel's moment. As I said to them, how many African languages are taught at Princeton? Can you name them? Okay, I can, there are 4. And so it is precisely in these ways that we reach the limit points. Oh, yes, you want the orange? There we go. It's precisely in these kinds of encounters that we reach some of the limits of working with the text. And I'm not sure if at the end of the day, the pedagogical value of teaching against the text justifies the continuing existence of forms of knowledge production in which that kind of teaching is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just say that, thank you for saying that. And I think that's one of the really crucial, problems that, I mean, as a Lit Hum instructor myself, and Priya can attest to this because she's in my class, we're constantly talking about this bind. And I always do think of it as a bind because, in thinking about a text we worked with recently, like Montaigne's essays, there's a lot that you can learn about the functioning and history of the ideology of the savage, the production, as you're just saying, Danelle, of the kind of ahistoricity that is involved in thinking about another culture as out of time, behind time. And yet, and you can see, I mean, I think in the way that often Montaigne is talked about especially by many lecturers in the core is, but he's also, of course, condemning the discourse of, xenophobia and trying to push back against it. But as we talk about in our class, it's like you can see him trying to push out from inside it, and he can't get out. And it's a struggle of mine as an instructor, and I think for my students too, about how we can get outside of that text as long as we're teaching it. And it's something I struggle with. So thank you for saying that. Do we have any other questions? We're coming up on 20 minutes over, and I really want to be mindful of impinging on everyone's time. But if there's maybe one more question, we can take it. And if not, then we will conclude.
I can ask a final question. This question, I guess I have Jason in mind based on some of the content of his presentation, but it could really be for everyone. And that's, how would you respond to the provocation offered by one of Columbia's lawyers during a recent bargaining session that, quote, graduate students don't produce value for the university? And I'm partly saying that to be, cheeky or whatever, but also how the university kind of weaponizes the concept of value and profit in ways that allow them to kind of deny the fact, as you said, Jason, in your presentation, like grad students are working, they're teaching. Teaching is part of what tuition is ostensibly being handed over in exchange for. So I know that that's kind of nebulous, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about that. And anyone else's too, if they want to respond.
If I might respond just very, very quickly. I mean, in many ways, Columbia University, it's like, its administration is not particularly nimble. And, everything they do, you could have read as like a playbook plan from any other university or really employer. Like, they're very conventional in the way they bust unions and fight their workers. And so in just that way, I mean, Columbia, I think, it's particularly good at alienating. I mean, its administration is very clunky and it's very ineffectual, but more importantly, it's very good at alienating all of its members, like more than other universities. Like, it's very not welcoming. And I find that its general mode is to presume that only the trustees own Columbia, right? They're constantly making it clear that we do not own either a preceptor or a graduate worker or a student any space. So I'm about to say something that I want to be a little careful about, and then I'll be quiet. And it's because a very important part for bargaining for the GWC right now is to make a distinction when graduate workers are workers and when they're students. And we don't want to blend these two things together. It's actually a crucial point in the Columbia decision in 2016, right, to make this distinction. So, and I don't want to go against that. However, you had movements like even in the 1970s, especially, not only you have where you had college students arguing that learning was work, right? They're helping to construct themselves as valuable members of their society, and therefore they're not customers in that way, and that they merely by being present in learning, you're doing a kind of labor and a kind of work. I am susceptible to this argument. I think that makes a lot of sense. And so in the danger of destroying the position of the bargaining committee and the Columbia decision, and its position of the NLRB, I would say the idea that you have to be literally producing profit for Columbia University to be producing value is absolutely absurd. That, the university is not a consumer system. We're not, you don't treat customers with a product, but we're constructing relationships and people are becoming themselves. And that is an absolutely crucial function of any society, right? And usually it's called social reproductive labor when this happens in a home or something, and therefore it has no value and is made invisible, and it's women's work, all these awful ways of coding this essential value. So that would be my response to Columbia's lawyers. And I wonder if they could even begin to understand what this means. I doubt it. So I don't know if that's worth anything.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jason. I like what you said there because you also deconstructed my question, because my instinct is to be like, no, we generate value, but you pointed out like we shouldn't be reducing ourselves in that way as students or instructors. So I really appreciate that.
Yes, no, that's a great question, Catherine. Thank you. And it's good just to always be quoting Columbia's lawyers back to them so that we can just kind of think through the collective absurdity of some of these statements. All right, well, on that note, I would really like to thank our panelists so very much for being here today. This has been a really, really wonderful conversation. I'm just so heartened to see the kinds of comments that we've been having in the chat about how these discussions need to continue. And I'm sure that they will in one shape or form. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all for coming and for participating.